The morning Pele Strand decided to walk into the wall was the same morning his neighbor Jonas tried to drive through it and folded the front of his pickup truck like a beer can. Pele had been standing at the edge of the gravel road that wound past Marta Ericsson's farm when it happened. He heard the engine gunning, the angry, rising whine of a man who had made up his mind, and then the flat, toneless impact. Not a crash. A crash has violence in it, a sense of release. This was quieter, more absolute. Metal pressed against something that refused to acknowledge metal. The truck stopped. The something didn't even notice. Jonas climbed out, stood staring at the crumpled hood, and said nothing. The steam rose in the cold morning air. Behind them, half a kilometer up the slope, the village of Asker went about its morning, in the dazed, slow-motion way it had gone about every morning since the ship appeared. Pele had been watching it for 7 days. Not obsessively, he wasn't the type, but the way you keep watching a bruise you can't stop pressing. It sat at the edge of the atmosphere where it had no business sitting. Enormous and completely still, a shape that the eye wanted to make sense of and kept failing. It wasn't a saucer. It wasn't a cigar. It was something that had been designed by minds that didn't share a single aesthetic instinct with any human being who had ever lived. It made his molars ache to look at too long. The barrier had appeared the same night. Nobody saw it go up. You found it the way Jonas found it. By walking or driving or riding a bicycle until the world quietly stopped letting you continue. It didn't hurt, it didn't spark or hum. It was simply the last place in any direction that the universe permitted you to stand, and beyond it was the same forest, the same fields, the same sky, except you couldn't reach any of it. Pease put his palm flat against it now, standing 20 meters from where Jonas's truck leaked coolant into the gravel. It was warm. Slightly warmer than air temperature. He had expected cold, glass cold, sterile, the cold of technology. But it was warm like the side of a sleeping dog. He didn't know what to make of that. He pulled his hand back and turned to walk into town. The village had about 400 people in it. 401 if you counted Pele's grandmother, who lived in the small house at the edge of the field, and who had been insisting for 3 days that everyone needed to calm down and eat something. She was not wrong, but nobody wanted to hear it. The community center had become the de facto headquarters of the crisis, which mostly meant that Walerius, the former county councilman who owned the hardware store, stood at the front of the room and said things in a loud, authoritative voice while people nodded or argued. Walerius was 62, thick through the chest, with the specific confidence of a man who had spent decades being the largest personality in any room he entered. He was not handling this well. "We need to establish a perimeter," he said when Pele walked in. "We need to map the boundary precisely, mark it at 10-meter intervals." "We know where the boundary is," said Ebba from the back of the room. Ebba was 24 and had been a forestry student before the ship arrived. She had a quiet, flat directness that Pele admired, and that made Walerius's left eye twitch. "It's a perfect circle, roughly 2 kilometers across, centered on the village. I walked it this morning. You walked the entire. It took 90 minutes. I used a compass and a length of paracord." Walerius opened his mouth and closed it. Pele found a seat near the wall. He looked around at the faces. Marta, 68, whose farm sat near the eastern edge of the zone. The Lindqvist brothers, Anton and Sven, who ran the auto shop. Jeanette, who taught at the primary school, and was currently sitting with her eyes closed, very still, the way she always sat when she was controlling herself. Young Wilmer, 17, who'd had his phone raised toward the ship since day one, live streaming to an audience that, for reasons they were beginning to understand, wasn't watching anymore. The outside world had gone quiet on the second day. Phones still worked inside the zone. Calls connected, data moved, but nothing came back. Messages delivered but never read. Emergency numbers rang endlessly. It was as if the world beyond the barrier had simply stopped being interested in them. Wilmer had been the one to figure that out. He'd stood in the middle of the community center with his phone and said, very calmly, "I think we're the only people who know we exist right now." He was 17, and he'd said it like a statement of fact, and Pele had decided in that moment that he liked him. "The question," Pele said now, into a pause in Walerius's planning, "is what they want." The room looked at him. "They've contained us," he continued. "Not killed us, not contacted us, contained us. The barrier is warm to the touch, temperature controlled. Our food and water supply is intact inside the zone. They've taken care of the basics." He stopped. "That's either threatening or it isn't, but it's deliberate." "You think they're studying us," Jeanette said. Her eyes were still closed. "I think that's one possibility." "Like specimens," said one of the Lindqvist brothers. His voice had something ugly in it. Or like patience, Ebba said. Could also be like patience. The room sat with that for a moment. On the 8th day, Pele found the node. He hadn't been looking for it specifically. He'd gotten into the habit of walking the boundary every morning. Not for any tactical reason. Just because it gave him something to do with his body while his mind worked, and because the boundary had become the most honest place in the zone. It didn't pretend, it didn't reassure. It was simply the fact of their situation, expressed in material terms. He was walking the northern arc when he noticed the discoloration. About 3 meters up from the ground, where the invisible wall met the tree line, there was a faint interference in the light. Not visible exactly, more felt. The way you feel a frequency that's just below hearing. A slight wrongness in the way the shadows fell. He stopped. He stared at it for a long time. Then he went and got Ebba. She was better at this than him. She had the kind of methodical patience that could look at something genuinely unknown and resist the urge to immediately decide what it was. She walked around it 3 times, holding her compass level, watching the needle. It didn't deviate. She pressed her palm to the air around the discoloration and pulled back. Warmer, she said. Yeah. Warmer than the rest of the barrier, significantly warmer. Yeah. She looked at it for another long moment. Power conduit, she said finally, or an access node. Something that has to work harder here than elsewhere. That's what I thought. Could be a structural vulnerability. Could be a monitoring point. Could be both. They stood there in the morning cold, 2 people at the edge of what was knowable, staring at the thing they'd found. We should tell Walarius, Ebba said. We should figure out what we're doing with it first. She looked at him sideways. Why? Pele thought about this. He thought about the way the barrier was warm like a sleeping dog. He thought about Wilmer saying, "We're the only people who know we exist right now," in his flat, steady 17-year-old voice. He thought about the ship, still and enormous, waiting. Because I think they're watching us the same way we're watching them, he said. And I want to know what we look like before we start making moves. What they looked like, it turned out, was small. Pele had an old laptop, battered, held together in 2 corners with electrical tape. And he'd spent the better part of 2 days cross-referencing everything they knew. The ship's arrival time, the barrier's geometry, the temperature differential at the node, the patterns of the ship's occasional slow rotation. He sat at the kitchen table in his grandmother's house, because she made tea without being asked, and because her presence, unhurried, practical, deeply unimpressed by existential catastrophe, was clarifying. What are you looking for? She asked him, on the second night setting a mug beside the laptop. A pattern. What kind? He rubbed his eyes. Any kind. They're doing this for a reason. Something has a logic, I just can't see it yet. She sat across from him. Outside, through the window, the ship was visible against the stars. Its running lights, if they could be called that, slow pulsing in a sequence that nobody had been able to decode. When your grandpa had the farm, she said, and a storm was coming, the cows always gathered in the northwest corner of the low field. Every time. Never the south, never the east. Always northwest. Pele waited. He spent 3 summers trying to figure out why. Thought it was the tree line, thought it was the slope of the ground. Turned out there was a spring under that corner. Warm groundwater. They could feel it through their hooves. She sipped her tea. The thing you're looking for is probably not the thing you think you're looking for. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the patient, slightly amused expression of someone who had given good advice and was waiting to see if it would be received. He went back to his data. 30 minutes later, he stopped. The temperature readings weren't about power. They were about direction. The warmest points of the barrier weren't random. They traced a path, irregular, not a straight line, something more like a current or a flow, that curved in a wide arc from the northern node, around the west side of the zone, and down toward the southern edge. If you connected them, if you imagined them as dots on a map, they described a lane, a corridor. He sat back in his chair. The barrier wasn't just a prison, it had a door. Telling people was the hard part. Not because they wouldn't believe him, because believing him meant deciding what to do about it. And that was the kind of decision that split communities along the fault lines that had always been there. Dormant. Waiting for the right pressure. Walarius wanted to use it. If there's a door, we go through it. That's not complicated. We don't know what's on the other side of the door, Ebba said. We know what's on our side of it. We know what it means to be kept. He said the word like it tasted bad. I don't care if there are 1,000 of those ships. You don't keep human beings in a box. Nobody's saying we accept it, Pele said. I'm saying we should understand it before we react to it. We can understand it afterward. That assumes there's an afterward. The room went quiet. Jeanette, who had been sitting with her usual stillness, opened her eyes. What do you think happens if we go through the door without understanding it? She asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. I don't know, Pele said. That's the point. What do you think happens if we stay here indefinitely? I don't know that either. She nodded slowly. Then we're not choosing between knowing and not knowing. We're choosing between two kinds of uncertainty. She paused. Which means we're choosing based on who we are, not what we know. Walerius stared at her. What the hell does that mean practically? It means, she said patiently, that if we go through their door on their schedule without any preparation, we're telling them something about us. And if we take the time to prepare and go through on our own terms, we're telling them something different. She looked at Pele. What do you need? He needed 3 days and he used them. Ebba mapped the full arc of warm points with a thermometer and a notebook, marking them on a hand-drawn chart that got tacked to the community center wall. The Lindquist brothers drove along the arc in their truck, slowly, testing the barrier every 10 meters, and confirmed that the southern terminus was measurably softer than the rest. Not soft enough to push through, but different. Different was something. Wilmer, who had stopped leaf streaming to nobody and started actually thinking, spent those same 3 days doing something that struck Pele as one of the most important things anyone in the zone was doing. He walked around talking to people, old people, mostly. He sat with Marta on her porch for 2 hours. He brought a notebook, not a phone, a paper notebook, and asked her what she remembered about her father's stories of the war, about rationing, about the peculiar psychology of being confined. What are you collecting? Pele asked him. What worked, Wilmer said simply. When people were stuck in bad situations and got out. What worked? Pele looked at this 17-year-old with his paper notebook and felt something that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it, a recognition. This was what humans did. Not just the technical problem solving, not just the barrier probing and temperature mapping. This, the gathering of narrative, the insistence that the past mattered, that the specific texture of how other people had endured was relevant, was worth writing down. He thought about what Jeanette had said, who we are, not what we know. He thought about the cows in his grandfather's field, gathering over the warm water, following the warmth without understanding it. He thought, maybe the door in the barrier isn't an exit, maybe it's an invitation. And maybe whether we accept it as one or refuse it as one is exactly the kind of information they're waiting for. On the 11th day, the ship moved. Not dramatically. It didn't descend, didn't send out probes, didn't broadcast any signal they could detect. It simply rotated, slowly, over the course of about 6 hours, and when it finished, the orientation was different. The portion that had previously faced east now faced south, toward the door. They were watching the door, or rather, they had oriented themselves toward it, watching to see what came through. Pele stood outside the community center and looked up at it for a long time. Anton Lindquist came to stand beside him. He was the quieter of the brothers, a man who mostly expressed himself through the quality of his work. Cars left his bay running better than they'd ever run. He had huge, careful hands. He looked up at the ship with the same methodical attention he gave to a suspect engine. You ever, he said after a while, work on something you didn't understand? All the time, Pele said. What do you do? Start with what you know, the parts you can see, the parts you can test. Pele paused. You work in from the edges. Yeah. Anton was quiet for a moment. Thing is, with engines, the engine doesn't care what you think about it. Doesn't matter how scared you are, or how confident. The engine just is what it is. Yeah, these things. He nodded toward the ship. They're not engines. No, they're watching, they're thinking, they're deciding. He exhaled. That's different. It is, Pele agreed. So working in from the edges might not be enough. It's all I've got. Anton considered this. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a flask. Battered aluminum, the cap worn smooth from years of use. He opened it, drank, and held it out. Pele drank. The aquavit was sharp and cold and landed in his stomach like a small, warm anchor. When you go through, Anton said, taking the flask back, I want to go with you. I haven't decided I'm going through. I know, when you do. Pele looked at him. I've been here all my life, Anton said. I fixed every car in this valley. My hands know this place. He capped the flask. I'd like to keep it. The decision, when Pele finally made it, came from an unexpected direction. He was at the node. Late afternoon, the light going sideways through the trees, laying long shadows across the ground. He had his palm against the warm air, where the node pulsed, and he was thinking about the ship and the door, and Jeanette's question about who they were, and he was thinking about his grandmother's cows. And somewhere in the intersection of all of that, something became clear. They'd been asking the wrong question. Not, what do we do with the door? That was tactics. The real question was, why did they show us the door? They hadn't found it by accident. The temperature differential, the current of warm points. It was too deliberate, too structured to be accidental. It was designed to be found. By beings with a certain kind of intelligence. By beings who looked for patterns, who moved carefully, who took 3 days to prepare before they acted. It was a test, and they'd already been passing it. The barrier wasn't a cage. It was a context, a controlled environment, warm, safe water and food intact, in which to watch a species decide how it behaved when it was afraid. What had they done? They'd mapped it. They'd organized. They'd sent a teenager around with a notebook to gather the wisdom of the old. They'd argued about caution and boldness and arrived, painfully, at a kind of middle way. They'd stood at the boundary every day and pressed their hands against it and tried to understand what it was. And they hadn't broken down. And they hadn't stopped being curious. He stood at the node and thought, they've been reading us this whole time, and we've been writing something worth reading. He took his hand away from the warm air. Time to find out if they agreed. They went at dawn. Not everyone. It wasn't a mass evacuation, not a charge. Pele and Ebba and Anton, with Wilmer insisting and then being allowed. Jeanette, who surprised everyone including herself. Marta, who said she'd spent 68 years on that land, and she wasn't going to miss whatever happened next. 6 people moving carefully down the arc of warm points as the sky went from black to deep blue to gray. They had no weapons. There was nothing in the zone that could serve as a weapon against whatever had built the barrier, and they all knew it. And carrying something symbolic would have been exactly the wrong signal. They had Wilmer's notebook. Marta had brought a thermos of coffee, which Pele thought was either very pragmatic or very funny, and maybe both. The southern terminus was easy to find by feel. The air there had a different quality, a slight give, like pressing on a bruise that was almost healed. Pele stood at it and looked back at the village, the church steeple, the community center with its lights already on, the rest of the 400 watching, from a respectful distance that had been Walerius's idea, and was the best idea he'd had throughout. Behind them, the forest. Above them, the ship. He turned back to the barrier. We're going through, he said. Not loudly, just said it. He stepped forward. The barrier parted. Not dramatically. It didn't explode or dissolve. It simply permitted him. The warmth moved with him, around him, like passing through a curtain of barely warm air, and then he was standing on the other side in the frost-stiff grass of the world outside. And the morning was exactly the same morning it had been inside the zone. The same cold, the same light, the same particular smell of Swedish autumn. The others came through one by one. Ebba, Anton, Wilmer, who looked back at the zone from the outside for the first time in 11 days with an expression Pele couldn't quite read. Jeanette, Marta, who immediately poured herself a coffee from the thermos and stood drinking it like she was waiting for a bus. They waited. The contact vessel came down out of the eastern sky 40 minutes later. It was small by any reasonable standard. Nothing like the ship which still hung motionless at the atmospheric edge. This was a shuttle-sized thing, dark and smooth, that descended in a long, flat curve and settled into the field about 200 meters from where they stood. It made no sound. It displaced the frost on the grass in concentric rings as it landed, and the rings stayed, perfect, and then were still. Nothing happened for a long time. Pele sat down in the grass. This seemed to surprise the others. Jeanette raised an eyebrow. Anton looked at him, and then after a beat sat down too. Then Wilmer. Then the rest of them, spreading out slightly, sitting in the cold grass, waiting, unremarkable, not performing anything. Pele thought, this is who we are. 6 people sitting in a field waiting to meet something that scares us to death. Not charging, not cowering, sitting, breathing, Marta drinking her coffee. He thought, if they've been watching us for 11 days, they know this. If they know we're afraid and that we did it anyway, they know we argued and planned and sent a teenager around with a notebook. They know we have a flask of aquavit and a thermos of coffee and 6 people who chose to be here voluntarily, representing 400 who chose to let them go. He thought, that's not a coincidence. That's a portrait. The vessel opened. What emerged was difficult, not in a threatening way. In the way that genuinely alien things are difficult, the way the ship had been difficult to look at. The eye trying to make sense of something it had no template for. There were 3 of them. They moved in a way that suggested bilateral symmetry but kept defying it. Their coloration shifted. Their size was hard to judge because the proportions kept reorganizing. They stopped about 30 meters away. The morning was very quiet. Pele reached into his jacket and took out the hand-drawn map. The one Ebba had made, the arc of warm points, the corridor, the node at the north end where he'd first felt the temperature differential. He held it up, one of them tilted. It was the closest thing to a head movement, a reorientation. Looking at the map, Pele set the map down on the grass in front of him. Then he looked at them directly and waited. What followed was not a conversation, not in any human sense. It lasted about 3 hours. There was no language, no sound, no visible technology of communication. What there was instead was a slow, careful exchange of information through the only medium they had in common: behavior, presence, the meanings that accumulated when two kinds of beings sat with each other long enough. The three of them moved closer in increments and stopped and watched, and moved closer again. Pele didn't move. Neither did the others, following his lead. At one point, Marta poured a second cup of coffee and held the thermos out toward the nearest of them, and it stopped completely, and held that stillness for almost 2 minutes, and then made a sound like wind through a very small aperture that none of them would ever be able to describe accurately. Wilmer wrote in his notebook. Not observations. There was nothing he could have written that would have captured it. He wrote names. The names of everyone in the zone. All 401 of them, starting from memory and then asking the others when he forgot. He wrote them in neat, careful columns, and when one of the three drifted close enough to look, he tilted the notebook toward it, and it looked at the columns of names for a long time. Pele didn't know what that communicated. He knew it communicated something. At some point, Anton produced the flask again, and Pele drank without thinking about it, and the warmth of it hit him in the chest, and he thought about his grandfather's farm, cows in the northwest corner of the low field, following warmth through their hooves without understanding it. And he thought, maybe that's all any of us ever do, follow the warmth. Trust that it leads somewhere worth going. Jeanette at one point just talked. Not at the three of them, not performing. Just talking quietly to Pele about what she was planning to do when they got back. Whether she'd keep teaching. Whether the kids would need different things from her now. Whether what had happened in the zone would change what she considered worth teaching. The words were ordinary and specific and true, and one of the three settled very still while she spoke. Like something listening, he thought, they're not here to be impressed. They're not here to see how brave we are or how smart we are. They're here to see what we value when we're afraid, what we carry with us. Whether we're the kind of thing that sits in a field with coffee and names and notebooks, or the kind of thing that drives trucks into walls until they fold. Both of those things were human. He knew that. 400 people in that zone, and most of them were somewhere on the spectrum between Jonas with his ruined truck and Marta with her thermos. That was honest. That was what they actually were. He hoped it was enough. The barrier came down in the late afternoon. No ceremony to it. They were walking back through the zone. The three beings had retreated to their vessel, which sat unmoving in the field, and the 6 of them had looked at each other and decided, wordlessly, to go back. And somewhere during the walk, Pele noticed that the air had changed. The particular quality of contained air, the slight closeness that had become familiar over 11 days, was gone. He stopped. He pressed his hand out to the side. Nothing, just air. Ebba was watching him. She did the same, reached out, found nothing. She turned in a slow circle, feeling the horizon. It's down, she said. They stood there. The sky was open in every direction. The world was simply the world again, continuous and unbounded, and it felt strange, not relief exactly. Relief would come later. What he felt right now was something more like the specific vertigo of a thing ending. The 11 days, the community center arguments, the morning walks along the boundary, Anton's flask and Wilmer's notebook and his grandmother's tea. He was going to miss it. That was the strangest part. He was going to miss the clarity of it. The small, defined world where every action had meaning, because there was so little space for noise. Wilmer was looking at his notebook. He flipped through the pages, the columns of names, the observations he'd made when he'd given up on the observations, and just started writing names, and then looked up at the open sky. What do you think we told them, he asked. Pele thought about it. That we're worth knowing, he said finally. I think we told them that. Is that enough? Pele looked at the sky where the ship still hung, unchanged, enormous, patient. I don't know, he said, but I think it's true. The vessel lifted without sound just before dark. Pele watched it from the field outside Marta's farm. standing in the same frost-stiff grass where they'd sat that morning. The ascending shuttle caught the last of the sunset and held it for a moment, a streak of orange against the darkening blue, and then it rejoined the ship, and the ship was still. The village behind him was loud with voices. Phones were working again, actually working, messages flowing both ways. The world outside suddenly aware they existed. Emergency services flooded with calls, news helicopters, a distant thunder approaching from the south. The 400 were handling it the way they'd handled everything. Badly and well in equal measure. Walerius already organizing, Jeanette already thinking about the children, Anton and Sven Lindqvist already debating whether Jonas's truck was salvageable. His grandmother appeared beside him. She had her coat on, hands in her pockets, looking up at the ship with an expression that was characteristically difficult to read. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "Coffee's on inside." He didn't move yet. He kept watching the ship. "They'll be back," he said. It wasn't a question. "Probably," she said. "We'll be different next time. Everyone will." "Of course." She sounded unbothered by this. "You're always different. Every morning you're different. That's the whole point." He finally looked at her. She looked back at him with the patient, slightly amused expression that he'd known his whole life, the one that said, "Ed, I have lived through many things, and they were all more complicated and less catastrophic than they seemed at the time." He thought about the barrier coming down, about the warmth it had held, that odd dog warmth, designed to keep them comfortable in captivity while something incomprehensibly larger than them decided what to do. He thought about how small they were, 400 people in a 2-kilometer circle, and how they had spent 11 days arguing and mapping and drinking flask aquavit and writing names in notebooks, and how that had apparently been the right answer, or not the right answer. There was no right answer. There was only the answer you gave, the shape your species made, when something vast and unknowable closed a hand around it and waited. They had made a particular shape, a human shape. He hoped it would still look like a good shape when they came back. He followed his grandmother inside, and the ship held its position in the darkening sky, and the coffee was hot.